I'll pass it to Shahril. And if I have a personal request, I'm very interested in the center. So maybe if something could be said from that perspective as well.
We'll try. Thank you, Adin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good evening, fellow panelists and everyone here today. It's my first time at WeWork. Always wanted to come. Seems as enticing as the photo suggested. Thanks to BB Foundation as well for the invite. I was very taken by both what YB Wong Shuki and Professor Shad spoke earlier. And in as much as I was taken by both their remarks, I'm going to try and readjust what I imagine I was going to say. I want to go at this, or my contribution early on, I want to go at this in a slightly different way. Maybe to sort of tell all of you where I'm coming from, because I think that who speaks and who we are as people and the opinions we hold, I think oftentimes gets lost. So you might see from my title, I'm no youth deputy chief. Some preconceptions, I imagine, already present. And I don't always say this, but I think in this particular instance I want to. Professor Shad mentioned a lot about accommodation in his textual analysis of the Constitution. I live and breathe that accommodation. I live and breathe that hybridity. I've always seen myself as a hybrid being in many ways, but most of which, or in the biggest way, in the sense that I'm a child of a mixed race marriage. So my mother is Chinese from Malacca, my father is Malay from KL. And it's not one of those Masuk Melayu cases in which the Chinese spouse not only converts into Islam, but in effect practices wholeheartedly quote-unquote Malay culture. In this case, my mom is still very much proud and practicing Chinese identity, whatever that is. So I've always grown up knowing that, as YB said, the idea of race and the idea of nationality is imagined, in as much as sociologically it is. And this is where I want to bring up my main point in this 5 minutes, which is that as much as it is important, crucial, and entirely essential to how we solve this idea of unity and whether we have to imagine new social contract and all the rest of it, as much as it's important to do proper textual analysis, as much as it is important for enhanced constitutional literacy, as you would put it, Prof, I think the main thing is we have different imaginations of what this country is. In WeWork in Equatorial Plaza, presumably there is a very cosmopolitan idea of what Malaysia ought to be. The people that I see day to day in my UMNO work will fundamentally disagree with many premises that maybe people in this room hold. And yeah, we could argue till the cows come home as to which is more valid than the other. But perhaps if the idea is nation building, it is about how do we find a way to reimagine this country, not entirely and not exclusively through textual analysis, but through figuring out the fears, the paranoia that exist in different spectrums of this community. So rather than say, look, Article X, Y, and Z shows that you are wrong, it ought to be that, look, why is it that certain communities feel under siege? Can blame politicians, can blame certain narratives that are being peppered. But I think empathizing with their concerns is really the first step to do. And once you do that, it's oftentimes having to not necessarily concede, but to use your words, accommodate to some of their fears that you might not agree with. So for example, one person in a particular community might find it troubling that there are 500 or 600,000 national type schools. Understand why that is, rather than say, look, that's actually allowed for in the Constitution because ABC. I think once you begin the conversation with trying to understand their fears, however you might think it is rational or not, I think that's where the gap is, right? So sort of, in a roundabout way, I'm trying to say is, Empathy is the first step. Second step is figuring out what kind of national values ought to underpin this idea of a reimagination of what Malaysian identity is. Because what I think we can all agree is that we have very different and parallel ideas of what this country is. What are our values? It may or may not be suggested in the constitution. It may or may not be suggested in Rukun Negara. Well, it is suggested in the Rukun Negara. But how much is actually absorbed and actually internalized? I think, in my mind, very little. So very little of the Rukun Negara. Not everyone can even recite the Rukun Negara once they leave school. It's in the back on the exercise board. It used to be back in my day. Yeah, back in my day. There was a Rukun Negara, but I think a lot of people then, it's never something that you really hold close to your self-consciousness as a Malaysian. So can build on things like that, but the idea is for this generation and the next to solve this idea of unity, apart from empathy, figure out what kind of almost non-ethnicized values we can create to have this idea of what Benedict Anderson would say, the national myth. So the myth of the imagined community. So in America, people might think it's the idea of the American dream, whether or not it's empirically proven, probably not. In Indonesia, they have this sense of one language. That's their sort of quote-unquote myth. Y.B. Suki correctly pointed out that's not entirely true, but that's the myth. So what is the Malaysian myth? I think falling back to the constitution and textual analysis alone isn't enough. So that's my main point. Maybe for the last minute, what I would also add is going back to the topic itself, education. If the idea, and if we agree that reimagining this country is a key long-term project, then education ought to be a method through which that occurs. So I personally fundamentally disagree with anyone who says that education's sole purpose is to produce graduates who get jobs. Some people think that's really what it's all about. So, how do we make sure there's high quality, high quality, high quality? Sure, high quality is important, and really that's what people go through education system for. But if you are in government or if you are in politics or any manner of nation building, you ought to be interested in how the system helps or does not help with national unity. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.